thank you all for coming along. For those of you that don't know, as I say, I'm Jonathan, co-founder of Purpose Disruptors. Purpose Disruptors is a not-for-profit organisation based in London, founded by three ex-industry insiders, myself, Rob McFall. Rob, gives a wave. And Lisa Lawless as well. And together we've got about 50, oh, it makes me feel old, about 50 years of experience working across creative agencies, media agencies, and client side. And I guess the thing that binds both Rob, Lisa, and myself is that we're viscerally aware, or became viscerally aware, of the connection between advertising and our climate emergency. As I put it, the better I did my job in terms of driving consumption for people like Shell and Diageo and Mazda and Kraft Foods, the more damage that caused, because advertising drives consumption and resource depletion. And so this was a very uncomfortable place for Lisa, Rob, and myself. But in that awareness, the three of us thought, what can our contribution be? What can we do to help that can allow others in the advertising industry and in the client community to take meaningful action to help address our climate emergency? So in response to that, we set up Purpose Disruptors, and our kind of purpose is to change the story of advertising and help create a future where ideally advertising works in harmony with the natural world. We've got three key strands to that work. Rob leads on Change the Brief Alliance, which is a fantastic learning platform taken up now by the big six holding networks. Lisa on Good Life 2030. She's actually currently involved in some shoots for our latest Agency for Nature work that's coming out on Valentine's Day. And I look after Advertised Emissions along with Nadine and Omon also on the call. And that brings us to today. And the purpose of this webinar is to kind of officially launch this report, which is Advertising's Evolutionary Moment. And we gave it this title because we see at this moment in the industry, clients, agencies, media owners, digital platforms, there's this sort of need to graduate or evolve the current focus when it comes to climate and sustainability away from the operational emissions. So just considering just operational emissions, to kind of consider the output that the industry is responsible for producing, commissioning, and displaying. So the creative work that leads to increased consumption. And we chose the word evolve because organisms is, of course, that survive and thrive are those that successfully change to their successfully adapt to their changing environment. And obviously, as we see, we're not only seeing dramatic changes in our natural environment, Valencia and obviously the LA fires, but there are many pressures and changes bearing down on the industry that we'll come on talk about. And so in the report, we talk about these pressures. I'll cover a little bit in a moment, but more importantly, share two examples from Oliver and M&C Saatchi that we're going to hear from today of the actions they're taking to change and meet this moment, so how they're evolving. And hopefully this provides some insight and some learning for all of us to see how the industry can kind of take advantage of this moment and thrive into the future, how we can evolve. So how, as you come to hear, this work is unfolding in real time through experiments and learning. This is exciting, but also can be quite tiring. So we hope that in this session, it'll allow us to see that we can all help each other. This is what this is about. This is about sharing the learning to help each other, perhaps starting more experiments from others on the call, because we believe, this is the way that things can evolve and can change. So on the call, we are joined, I'm so happy to say, we're joined by Alexis McGivern. Give us a wave, Alexis. Alexis is the Net Zero Integrity Manager at Oxford Net Zero and co-chair of the Professional Services Providers Working Group. Lucy Usher, who's Head of Sustainability at Oliver, gives a wave, Lucy. And Pam Noakes, who's the Global Sustainability Director at M&C Saatchi. And so in terms of the running order, Alexis is going to first give us an overview of serviced emissions, which is a kind of a fantastic new kind of idea that's been introduced by Oxford Net Zero and Race to Zero, which includes the continuous improvement model and the 6 action areas that she's going to take you through. I'm going to then share a very brief history of advertised emissions and how we have arrived at this moment. And then we're going to move to the kind of the key bulk of the session, which is to hear from Lucy and Pam. So I'm going to share how the why and the how they adopted the service emissions action areas, including Lucy calculating the advertised emissions for Oliver. They'd also share kind of the challenges and the positives of doing this. We're then going to open up to you, to open up to Q&A for any questions that you might have. And then we'll finish with an opportunity for you to share what actions you can take to ideally advance this work and evolve your own organisations in the directions that we feel is appropriate and necessary. So with regard to Q&A, if you've got any questions, please share them in the doc that Nadine's about to drop in the chat. We'll put it in the chat a number of times. So please feel free, if questions come to you, please share them in this. And we'll also actually provide a little bit of space for to put questions in once we've finished the session with Lucy and Pam before we start to the Q&A. Nadine will share the questions into the room from the list. So if you have questions, please don't put them in the chat, put them in a doc. So I hope that's everybody's able to access that. Any questions on that? Strangely, any questions on that, put them in the chat, but any questions for any of the speakers, put them in the doc. Okay, and finally, before we start, obviously, it's a bit of a momentous week. We had a chat yesterday about events in the US yesterday, and we've chosen not to talk about this. We want this call to be focusing on what we can change and what we can work with, rather than perhaps trying to predict what's going to happen as a consequence of Trump's actions, such as the news that he's going to come out of the Paris Agreement. There was a fantastic quote in the FT at the weekend, or last week actually. A European politician said, "We're all cats and Trump is holding the laser pointer." So today we'd rather not be cats chasing that red dot. So with that, I'm going to put up some charts, and Alexis is going to talk us through serviced emissions. So let's have a look at this. It's so slick.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, and thanks everyone for being here. As Jonathan mentioned, my name is Alexis McGivern, and actually, as of yesterday, I have a new job title, which is Head of Stakeholder Engagement at Oxford Net Zero. So we are a research group based at the University of Oxford, and I will tell you a little bit more about our work, but I'm here in my capacity as the co-chair of the Professional Service Providers Working Group, which was a working group convened by the Race to Zero and Oxford Net Zero to talk about this idea of serviced emissions. So if we can go to the next chart, please. So as Jonathan mentioned, we're coming to you at the state of 2024 being the first full year that we've breached the 1.5 degree temperature limit. This is just a handful of climate-related disasters over the last year. Valencia in the top left-hand, Los Angeles top bottom left-hand. Then we have the Alberta wildfires, floods in Poland, and a typhoon in Vietnam. There's a lot of work being done by scientists, including at the University of Oxford, on really understanding the link between climate change and emissions, especially from combusting fossil fuels with these disasters. But the main thing to understand is that climate change is happening. It's happening because of us. And also we have an increasingly small but important window to effectively govern solutions and to act in ways that are in our best interest in the long term, but also in solidarity with people in the present experiencing climate-related disasters such as these. And I think it's really incumbent upon us to rise to that challenge and rise to that opportunity to grow and change. So next chart, please. At the same time, I always like to start my presentations with a reminder that from Catherine Wilkinson, who, if you haven't read the anthology, All We Can Save, it's a really beautiful anthology put together by climate experts. And it's really about, we talk a lot about how much we've lost, but not enough about all we can save if we act. Just on the behind there is the warming stripes. So that is the average temperature in each year for the last few hundred years. This is put together by an academic at the University of Reading. Just a real visual reminder of how much we've changed our environment so rapidly. But also, as I said, it's the time to rise to the occasion and act in accordance with our own values and for the protection of ourselves and those in the future. So next chart, please. As I mentioned, I sit in a research group called Oxford Net Zero. We're about 60 researchers across 11 departments of the university. So in my day-to-day, it's amazing. I get to work with climate physicists, engineers, lawyers, anthropologists, geographers. So it's a real diverse group of academic interests. And I sit in a group that's basically the bridge between academia and practice. So how can we take these academic understandings of net zero and what it would mean to deliver net zero well and translate that and make that operational, essentially, for different types of stakeholders. So we work a lot on the standards landscape, on standards like the SBTI or within the ISO system, but we also work on giving best practice guidance, for example, to businesses on their offsetting and what good offsetting practice looks like. Next chart, please. This working group that I'll give you a bit more detail about was also co-convened by the Race to Zero, and maybe by a show of hands, if I could see who is familiar with the Race to Zero, who has heard of the Race to Zero, if this is maybe the first time. Okay, a few people. This is helpful. Thank you. It's essentially within the Paris Agreement that governs state-level action on climate. There's a ratcheting up instrument for ambition. So every 3 to 5 years, you need to submit a plan that shows your country was more ambitious than it was the last time you submitted a plan. And that's called a nationally determined contribution. And partly because of, some political changes that made the Paris Agreement feel quite tenuous a few years ago around COP26, and partly because there's such a moving base on climate, and people wanted to really have a way to be held accountable. This campaign, the Race to Zero, brought together non-state actors who aren't beholden to the same kind of ratchet ambition as under the Paris Agreement to say, this is the minimum good behavior you need to exhibit on climate to be part of the race, and you will be continually, held accountable or given advice and guidance on how to actually continue meeting those kind of climate ambitions. So Race to Zero and Oxford Net Zero came together to convene this working group to talk about service emissions and the important role of professional services providers. So next chart, please. So as you all know, having experienced much more experience than I do in the professional services industry, professional services providers are an organization, an individual, or a department that sells a service rather than a physical product. And it's really based on both expertise and also the ability to have trusted relationships with your clients, to guide them and advise them, and do what they can't do necessarily in-house. And so this includes, of course, consultants, management consultants, advisors, lawyers, and then crucially for today's topic, advertising firms and PR firms. And the working group that we brought together was really around asking the question, to what extent do these professional services providers, how can we have them facilitate rather than hold back the transition to global net zero? So this brought us to, next chart, please, to this idea of service emissions, that professional services providers have an impact on the either increase or decrease of emissions on behalf of a client. So if you're advising a client, for example, as an engineering firm to design a building that has high levels of concrete, where, for example, wood might be an option, that is a higher emissions decision that you are making as an engineering consulting firm that will then be taken up as advice by the client. In the same way for advertising and PR firms, marketing advice that leads to an uplift in sales. To what extent can professional services providers be brought into the discussion around facilitating and speeding up the transition rather than providing advice that would hold it back? So next chart, please. So just to walk through an example, and this is specifically around marketing and advertising services, but we look at sort of negative impacts, i.e. ones that increase greenhouse gas emissions, and then positive impacts, i.e. those that lower greenhouse gas emissions. So on the negative impacts, this could be accelerating unsustainable consumption, facilitating the fossil fuel industry's reputation or facilitating sales through advertising, or greenwashing, for example, in what is increasingly being regulated around unfounded claims of carbon neutral or net zero. Now, in the EU, those claims mean something, and in the UK as well through the Advertising Standards Association. So that's what can increase greenhouse gas emissions. But then on the positive impact, advertising and marketing services can play a really important role in promoting sustainable products, services, and lifestyles, and also facilitating consumer awareness campaigns. So next slide, please. So there exists a whole network, a whole ecosystem around measuring and monitoring greenhouse gas emissions. But to date, most of the standards don't really capture this idea of influence or advice, because it doesn't fall neatly into the system that we've created, which is scopes 1 to 3, which is created by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the most used corporate standard for measuring emissions. And this is exciting, not just because I'm a standards nerd, self-proclaimed, but because this really governs how companies measure their emissions. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is being revised now for the first time in 20 years. So these categories and the ways that we measure emissions are literally 20 years old, and they have not been updated with our understanding of science, our understanding of how climate action should work, and they're being updated now for the first time in 20 years. So I sit on the technical working group with about 30 other experts on revising the corporate standard for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And one of the things we're thinking about is how do we introduce this idea of service emissions or influence into the standards that will actually govern how emissions are measured and managed. So that's just a little bit of insight in terms of the standards. This is also happening, concurrent processes are happening for revision at the Science Based Targets Initiative, the largest validator of corporate climate targets in the world, and the ISO system, the International Standards Organization, which is developing its own net zero standard. So when even 5 years ago, net zero was a bit of a wild west, there are now standards that are pinning down what that actually means, and we're trying to pin that down for the professional services industry as well. So just being conscious of time, wanting to hand it over to my co-panelists, I'll just flick through this, where we came to in terms of exploring this idea with service emissions. And we brought together this amazing working group of professional services providers, Jonathan being one of them, representing Purpose Disruptors. We had environmental consultants, lawyers, and different types of association firms trying to look at this idea for service emissions. And we produced this guidance that was published at COP28. Then we went through a long consultation period. We received hundreds of inputs, and we rejigged, for lack of a better word, and launched it again in September 2024. So this is pretty fresh, not that fresh anymore, but still decently fresh. And what we came to, the next chart, is just really emphasizing that we need to look beyond just operational emissions. Operational emissions are important. They represent, what light bulbs you're using in your office, how your employees are getting to work. These kind of things are really vital. But we want to broaden the scope to look into your areas of influence, into the type of work that you're doing, the clients that you're working with, and the kind of services you're offering and the advice you give. And here, there's obviously no cut or dry, categorization of what would be acceptable versus non-acceptable work in terms of increasing greenhouse gas emissions. But what we do know is that the fossil fuel industry has spent decades trying to mislead and disrupt progress on climate change. And we know that facilitating their existence is most likely and almost certainly misaligned with a 1.5 degree future. And we're starting to see that represented in legal cases. So June of 2023 saw the first time that a professional services firm was actually held liable on climate grounds for the advice that they gave. So Multnomah County in Oregon sued ExxonMobil, massive oil and gas company based in the United States, for climate heat damages. And actually, McKinsey was named as the co-defendant in the suit because they were providing advice to ExxonMobil at the time. So the case was basically brought on the grounds of ExxonMobil did this stuff, but McKinsey, you were their strategic advisors during that time, and you need to be held accountable. And that's the second time that McKinsey has gotten into trouble for its advice. It was also sued for settled eventually for $650 million for its role in advising Purdue Pharma during the opioid crisis. So there is precedent for holding professional services providers accountable for the advice they give. And what we're trying to do with this work is really for professional services firms to get ahead of any potential liability and instead say, how can I contribute to the transition? So just if you can flick through the next one, what we came to is sort of a continuous improvement model where we offered a series of recommendations, which actually are perhaps easier to read on the next slide, which really focused around a few key pillars around understanding what your strategy and vision is for a 1.5 degree aligned work, what kind of governance you have in place in order to facilitate any changes in your firm to facilitate that, looking at your client and project selection, doing a bit of due diligence of mapping, really understand where you sit, seeing how you can embed climate into conversations with your clients, regardless of whether or not the brief of the project is about climate change, measuring your impact and reporting on your progress, and then finally seeing how you as a firm can advocate for systems level change at the regulatory or policy level. And I'll drop a link to the report in the chat, but that's just to set the tone for our conversation with Pamela and Lucy, and really looking forward to the conversation from here. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alexis. Fantastic whirlwind tour of what's happened and where we're at. Yeah, and the McKinsey stuff I think is a real eye-opener and a sort of perhaps a prelude to things to come as well in this area. So just to sort of just to kind of put that in the context of kind of the advertising industry. So we were originally kind of inspired to do advertised emissions on the left-hand side by financed emissions, which is a well-established concept within the finance industry. So if you're HSBC and you are yes, you can do your operational emissions, your service, your business travel, your branches. But if you're going to lend money to that coal-fired power station in Poland, if you're HSBC, then the emissions associated with building and running that coal-fired power stations are on you because that's a decision, a business decision that you chose to make. So porting that idea over to advertising in terms of advertised emissions, and then obviously it's starting to emerge within other professional service providers in terms of law with the idea of advised emissions, and then it'd be interesting to see when McKinsey and Accenture and EY and the rest get on the bus with management consultants and other PSPs as well. So we sort of talk about advertised emissions as serviced emissions for the advertising industry with its own methodology, in the same way that advised emissions are serviced emissions for the law profession with its own methodology. And we define advertised emissions as the greenhouse gas emissions that result from the uplift in sales generated by advertising. So a goal for advertising primarily is to help drive sales for a particular client, and that has a carbon consequence. You have an influence, so therefore there's a call to take to understand the impact of the influence that you have in terms of uplift in sales. And we've done 3 reports to date. We launched in 2021. And with the first report, the first 2 reports actually focused on the kind of the national figure for advertised emissions in the UK, and the latter report that we're here to talk about today is a much more of a focus on the organisational level, showcasing the learning and experiments that have been taking at that level. So just in terms of what's happened, as I say, we launched it and we were invited by the UNCCC to launch advertised emissions at COP26. It was then the year after we started our relationship with Race to Zero, it was adopted as a leadership practice for members. In 2023, the first disclosure by Dentsu as part of their TCFD reporting was released. We've then received support and funding from the UK government via Innovate UK, and the team from Portsmouth, a lot of them on the call, including Omon, who has joined us as our KTP associate. And then, as I say, last year, joined forces and understood more how we can fit in with the concept of serviced emissions. And I think something that is sort of, when we started, it was kind of like an innovative idea from a non-profit, and this is sometimes how these things start. we were focused on reporting emissions with a focus on measurement and the big number at a national level, and it was largely confined to the sustainability department. And I think what we've noticed in terms of the evolution of the idea is that now it's kind of been incorporated into global climate organizations. So it's graduated and matured in terms of its sort of influence and appropriateness and acceptability. It's become a framework for risk management and carbon emissions reporting that we're going to come to hear about. It's not just about the number and measurement. It's actually one of the 6 action areas that Alexis has just talked you through. And this is kind of reflecting this sort of graduation from it being just about the sustainability department, but actually being seen as a strategic management tool to enable the transformation of organizations to be able to be fit and thrive in a climate future, such per the photos that Alexis has shown you. So our mission now is, to support the advertising industry, to embed the service emission action areas into their organizations, and co-creating together a robust, high integrity methodology for advertised emissions that becomes a global standard that allows the industry to measure and reduce their emissions in line with climate science, because that's what the world needs us to take responsibility for and step up into. And in terms of our working group, we have a fantastic array of organizations in the working group. And we've got representatives from network groups, so Dentsu, Havas, and Publicis. Recently been joined by a kind of a threshold organization in between advertising and management consulting, Accenture, a fantastic range of agencies, obviously Oliver and M&C as part of that. And media owners as well, and academic institutions. So I think we've got a good array of both local and international organisations and bodies involved in the working group. And just to sort of kind of set the scene a little bit, we believe, and many understand, that the economy will transform. In order to ensure we try and retain ourselves within 1.5, hopefully 2 degrees, we need to reduce the emissions in this as a UK context. So Keir Starmer saying that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 81%, which is a dramatically large number, by 2035. And the House of Lords report states that 32% of that reduction needs to come from changing consumption habits. So air source heat pumps, flying less, changing diets. You kind of know the drill in terms of how we need to transition from a higher carbon economy, society, consumer behavior to the lower carbon alternative in order to hit those numbers. And so that's like the changing landscape that agencies and media platforms need to move into. And then also within the context of the report that that we produced, we also highlight this kind of surround sound of pressure. And so within that, there's a whole bunch of things that you can see in the report. So, for example, litigation and the regulatory environment. Johnny White at Client Earth, exploiting greenwashing, saying now that high carbon advertising is a legal red zone. He said that last year in the report, and that's obviously been just brought forward a little bit more closely with the story that McKinsey from Alexis. So if you're working on fossil fuel companies, does that mean that you are going to get into trouble? From a climate-related risk point of view, as I mentioned, Dentsu have already calculated their advertised emissions as part of the TCFD report. It's likely that it'll also be included within the CSRD regulation as well, for those of the EU that know that. Investors like Innova in the EU have engaged advertising network groups about advertised emissions. And many other things. Just hearing Alexis speak again, the possibility of advertised emissions, service emissions being incorporated within the GHG protocol, Scope 3, SBTI, and ISO. You see that there's this sort of, these all interact with each other, and they're kind of forcing the change. These multiple interconnected forces are forcing a change within the advertising industry. So our kind of conclusion to that is that we believe that there will be transformational change in the advertising industry. This is inescapable. We think that it's inevitable given the pressures and the requirements of our society to transition. We also understand that the current day challenges within the advertising industry, organizations within all PSPs, limit the capacity of those organizations to think in the medium to long term. So the question then has to be is what are the immediate steps that can be taken today that can serve the longer term sustainability? And I guess step one, to use the chart that Alexis shared, is simply accepting the need to shift from operational emissions to begin to consider the work that we do for our clients and the consequences of those actions. And this is, as it turns out from our experience, can be quite a challenging thing for organizations to want to accept. But if we are going to have to undergo transformational change and we are going to thrive in the future, this is a necessary acknowledgement that we have impact and influence, and we will need to accept that this shift. And the second one is, as we'll hear from Lucy and Pam in a moment, is kind of mapping the client portfolio. This can be a sort of simple starting point to understand the current mix and impact of the services. So, for example, how much revenue and what kind of business are you doing with red brands? What kind are you doing with amber brands? And what are you doing with green brands? And how can that kind of mix perhaps shift over time? And just before we start that, I just want to tell a little story which we quite like. And it's this idea, there's a story that I've heard from the war, and it's this, that kind of in the early 30s, that the UK started to build a new fighter plane. However, the government didn't want to consider things were going to change. They believed that Germany didn't pose any kind of threat, or even that they could be pacified, and there was absolutely no chance of another war given the horrors of the First World War. But the plane engineers, they saw things differently. They believed that things would unfold differently. So whilst the government stopped the project, the engineers continued to work on the plane in their garages or in their workshops. They did the work they believed was needed, although others didn't see it that way. Events changed, the war started, and because those engineers saw what the authorities and others failed to see, the plane was far more ready for action. They had done the work that was needed. That plane was the Spitfire. And so we think the situation is the same now. We believe transformational change in the advertising industry is inevitable. The work is to prepare for that change, to be one of the engineers tinkering away and developing the capacity for the organizations, for the industry as a whole, to be ready for that change. The good news for all of us, fortunately, is that those people exist. So we're really grateful that Lucy and Pam are going to share a bit about their tinkering and their experiments with us now. So Lucy and Pam, great to see you. I'm going to ask the first question to Lucy. Just as a way of introducing yourself, just tell us a bit about your organisation and its climate-related ambitions, and kind of actually what motivates you to want to do this work.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jonathan. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So I'm Lucy Usher, and I've been heading up sustainability at Oliver for about 2.5 years now. Oliver is the world's first and only company to exclusively design, build, and run bespoke in-house agencies and marketing ecosystems for brands. We do that with a mix of creative and technology. What that means is that we actually have teams of people sat inside brands all over the world, in over 40 countries, between 200 and 300 brands at any given time. In the UK, we're about 1,000 people. So we're quite a sizable organisation, and growth is really important to us as well. In terms of climate ambitions and sustainability ambitions, the business has been very proactive in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion before starting on its journey then in terms of environmental action. But from 2021, Oliver had set its own net zero target publicly by joining Ad Net Zero. Fully understood that there was an awful lot to do around operational emissions, but also recognised that seemed to be a small piece of the impact based on the realities of what advertising and marketing can do in terms of driving consumption. In terms of why I'm motivated to be part of this project, and why, as Jonathan nicely put it, I've been tinkering with methodologies like advertised emissions. I simply put, I see it as my role to actually look on the business's behalf at what the potential risks and opportunities are related to sustainability. That is my role, but it's so much bigger than operational emissions. We are in a currently transitioning economy. The landscape is incredibly complex. What that means for business risks and opportunities is part of my role to figure that out. And there was a big kind of black hole in the area of, there's clearly an impact in terms of who we support and work with and grow with in terms of our clients, in terms of what that real world impact is. When it comes to sustainability, which particularly in the world of carbon is extremely measurable. And this whole area seemed very unmeasurable. And that to me was a red flag. It was, why wouldn't we be involved in this, to try and start to understand how do we put some quantifiable metrics against this, recognize the risk and opportunity for the business, get ahead of a significant change, and make sure that we're part of the progress.
Thanks, Lucy. And Pam, do you want to share a bit about M&C and why you do this, why you do what you do?
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. So hello, everyone. Lovely to see you all. So I'm Pam. I'm the Group Sustainability Director at M&C Saatchi. We're a global advertising communications network of about 40 or so different agencies, and we cover creative, strategy, media buying, passion, so sports and entertainment, influencers, and also a range of global and social issues, work for government agencies and non-profits. And we have about 2,300 people globally. So again, another sizable organisation. And I work in the advertising communications industry because I'm convinced of the power of communications to help create the behaviour change we need to move to more sustainable products and services and help speed that transition that we know is coming, hopefully, and that we're all going to be on track to achieve. And this, as Jonathan said, is a really big contribution to the world's maintaining a livable future. We're not just like a thing on the side. We are a big part of the story by driving that behaviour change. So at M&C Saatchi, we have a number of different planet commitments. Some of them are about our direct impact, so our operational emissions, but some of them are about our clients. And one of them is to increase the percentage of revenue that we generate from planet positive campaigns. And another is to review potential new clients based on their impact on planet and people. So although reducing our direct emissions is super important and takes up quite a large proportion of my time, those two commitments are actually why I chose to work at M&C Saatchi when I joined about 3 years ago. So these two commitments really straddle the whole serviced and advertised emissions piece, and that's really helped me in my work because it's kind of a guiding star that drives everything I do, which then means that folding this into serviced and advertised emissions has really made sense. And we can't win that planet positive work if we're not reducing our own emissions. So it's kind of a big virtuous circle.
Great, thanks, Pam. So yeah, I think for some this feels like, you know, step one was kind of like take the leap from operational emissions into kind of, you know, considering, you know, the work that we do and the consequences of that. Can you sort of talk a bit about why you believe that to be important, and like why service emissions can engaging with the 6 areas can help with this? Lucy, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of why service emissions is important in those 6 areas, I mean, it was an interesting experiment actually to map what Oliver's actions had been against the 6 service emissions areas, because really what I was doing, not alone, but with heads of departments and a team supporting as well, I was sort of sensing and researching into what are the areas that need the most attention, that are the most impactful, that we should be prioritizing. You're always going to have too much to do when it comes to sustainability. So actually being really strategic about where you put your limited time and resource is very important. And so the way that the 6 areas of the service emissions has really helped us is that actually, to Pam's point, it puts it into a really logical framework. It really neatens it up. It gives everything a home. They all feed into each other. And so, I mean, there's a couple of examples I can talk to now, if you'd like me to, Jonathan. So one of those was around, you know, seeking opportunities to engage clients on climate and sustainability. Well, we were actually already starting conversations with clients through the world of AdGreen. So AdGreen is around sustainable production best practice. You know, it sort of sits mostly in the operational area actually, but really by asking clients to pay the levy and support the AdGreen initiative around sustainable best practice in production, that was kicking off and opening the door into bigger conversations around sustainability. Well, you know, speaking to the client, well, you've clearly got within your brand actually much higher, bigger ambitions related to your own sustainability goals. How can we support you in that? Are we doing enough to partner with you and help you go further? So, you know, that sits nicely within one of the areas of serviced emissions. And also in terms of mapping a client portfolio, you mentioned it briefly at the end of your slides, Jonathan. But, you know, as I said, part of my role as I see it is looking further into the future in terms of what does this business need to be aware of in terms of being a successful long-term business, and actually understanding the, you know, increasingly real risks around who we work with is a part of that. And it's not just risks, it's also the opportunities. So aligning ourselves more with businesses that are absolutely on the road to a net zero transition and part of that economy seems like a very smart thing to do. So, you know, that's also where the framework has helped us put some of that work that we've done into nice, neat buckets, and it comes out as a very logical framework, which is also much easier to explain upwards as well.
Yeah, thank you. Just if for people who haven't seen the report, actually in the report, pages 40, 41, we've got a very handy thing here. We've got the 6 action areas across the top, and then these are the actions that M&C and Oliver are already taking across those 6. So you can start to see how they've already started populating it, which is fantastic. And I think also, Lucy, what you're saying, which is and something we talk about in Purpose Disruptors, is like, what's your horizon of change? If your horizon of change is operational emissions, does that make you a good partner for clients that are more ambitious than you in terms of their net zero? So if your horizon of change is, we see the industry, the economy is going to transform. We see these pressures are coming on us. We're going to face into that because our horizon of change is in the medium to long term. That feels like a much more strategic, powerful, influential conversation than restricting yourself to saying, no, we're just responsible for our operational emissions, and we're not going to think about our impacts and our influence beyond that. So I think from a strategic business point of view, that just feels like kind of smart business sense, right? So thank you. Pam, what are your thoughts on, you know, why taking more of a holistic approach, and perhaps some suggestions of how you've been doing that?
Yeah, so we kind of, I'd like to start from the kind of risk piece, I think, and then move on to that horizon strategic piece afterwards. So for us, I mean, we've identified that it's a genuine business risk and a blocker to growth, to the discussion we just had. We actually already have some clients in the clean energy and NGO space who ask us who else we work with, and we won't win their work if we don't fit their criteria. And we know that there's likely to be more clients who are going to ask the same thing in the relatively near future. My money's on healthcare clients and clients that are kind of sustainability leaders in their sectors as being the first businesses off the mark. Jonathan, you've already mentioned the CSRD and how that might start to affect clients and what they want from their agencies as they drive transparency down the supply chain. And actually, we're starting to ask the same thing, because we know that companies with mature sustainability programs ask their suppliers to filter their requirements down to their own suppliers. As what we want to do is get ahead of the game, and we're revising our own supplier questionnaire so that includes a question related to other clients that our suppliers might work for. And our view is, you know, it's not about decision making, it's just about gathering basic information, because the earlier you have basic information, the quicker you can jump ahead if you need to. Yeah. Very much agree that the economy is going to change, and I think it's worth thinking about which sectors those changes might be coming from. I think there's going to be a lot more sustainable brands that we could potentially be doing work for in energy, biotech, food tech, novel materials, and they might well have a completely different set of requirements than our existing clients. So we need to kind of see where our own client portfolio fits within that mix and what they might want from us in the future. There's obviously, you've also mentioned, you know, the greenwashing risk, but I think it's not just a risk of greenwashing for our clients, but it's also internally. You know, sometimes our teams believe that they're doing the right thing by helping to promote more sustainable products, but they might be doing that for a big polluter that is greenwashing. And I think if you don't understand where your clients sit within the mix of risk, then it's really hard to pinpoint where you might be at more risk of greenwashing than in other parts of your portfolio. Also, kind of commercially, you know, if you've got a large proportion of high carbon clients and then tobacco style advertising bans come into play, then suddenly you've got quite a big hole in your revenue that you have to make up for as a business. I imagine that happened in France when there were bans around aviation and fossil fuels. And so if you actually adopt the service emissions principles and take them kind of systematically, but just starting from a simple starting point, it can help you highlight where those risks and opportunities are. And as you say, move the conversations out of the sustainability space and elevate it to boardroom level. But I think maybe that made it sound quite complicated. Just wanted to stress at the end that it's actually really easy to make a start in this area. You don't need to make any big decisions. You just need to start gathering some data. And if you're doing a kind of down and dirty piece of work, you don't even need to gather a lot of data. Even if it's just your top 10 clients, you start to understand where they sit in this kind of risk portfolio and start to think about how you can move them on and what conversations you need to be having either internally or with those clients themselves around different kinds of work that you could be doing for them.
Great, thank you. So I think it's interesting, like the 2 steps that we just shared there, you know, the idea of moving from operational emissions to thinking about the client work and the client mix. So you've clearly made that kind of, I don't know if that's a strategic leap, intellectual leap, moral leap, whatever the leap is, but you've made it, and that's absolutely fantastic. So that's kind of step 1, and then and then to the second step, you know, you just started touching into this, Pamela, about, like, you know, considering the client mix and what your current portfolio is of that. Lucy, can you, because I think this is something that people think is really difficult, but I think that your experience of working with Futera's client disclosure report and then calculating your advertised emissions for the clients that you did, can you just talk about kind of how that came about? And because I think if I'm sitting on I'm on the call, I'm like, this is really scary. So just being able to sort of articulate this is something you can do tomorrow and get done in a couple of weeks, I think will really reassure people that this is totally in my gift.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this was a few years ago now, and I just really wanted to take some initial steps in the right direction to find out more. You know, sustainability is one of those things when you start to do strategies, you realize there's so many components to it. Unfortunately, as much as you might like to, you cannot see 10 steps ahead. You have to start moving forward and the path becomes clearer as you go. So I was like, okay, how do we start to get some information around this black hole of, you know, the impact of the types of businesses that we work with? And at that time, a couple of years ago, as part of the Advertised Emissions working group with Purpose Disruptors, and the methodology was in development, I actually at that time didn't feel ready to use it. I didn't have much spare resource in my team. I was quite overwhelmed with an awful lot of priorities in the operational space, but I could see that this was really important. So I looked for an even more entry-level way to get a view on it. And I came across the brilliant Futera's template, which is the client disclosure report. It's freely available. I just did it by researching, and it was really, really simple to use. It was just 2 or 3 pages looking at where the revenue for your business comes from in terms of sectors and industries, filling that into the table, and then they had grouped their own definitions of who was a high carbon client or industry, and who might be considered a controversial client, so things like gambling and betting and things like that. And it wasn't that, you know, that was their suggestion, so you could take that and absolutely adapt it to your own definitions of what's important for you as a business to understand, but it gave a really easy to use template. So we started with that, brilliant. We had our baseline for how we could kind of start to map our existing client portfolio back in 2021, I think we did that. And then by 2022, we were ready to give advertised emissions methodology a go. We were happy for it to be far from perfect. We just wanted to see how far we could get. I must stress, I did not do it on my own. I have a team of 2 other people who work with me, and Alexandra especially was a really instrumental part in just crunching through the numbers. But actually what we found by, you know, working with Nadine when we wanted a bit of extra clarity on the methodology was it was surprisingly simple just to give it a go as that first, you know, what's that version 1 draft. We decided to just go for understanding our advertised emissions based on the revenue from our top 20 clients. I mentioned that we have over 200. We didn't need to go into the excruciating detail of every client. We'd have been doing it, we'd still be doing it now. And whilst that would be interesting, it would be too late to be useful. So really what we wanted was, you know, that kind of don't eat the elephant all at once approach, that 20/80 approach of the top 20% of clients by revenue is a big enough chunk of our business to help us understand what does that impact look like. We followed the advertised emissions methodology. We checked it with Nadine when we weren't quite sure and had some questions. And it came out with an insight that was usable within a couple of weeks, which for us was that in the same year, so 2022, this was, our advertised emissions, just for those top 20 clients, was approximately 42 times larger than what our operational emissions was. Now, that was an internal exercise, right? There wasn't a client discussion here, but what that told me and helped me to explain much more simply to stakeholders above me was in the same way that operational emissions are becoming much more closely looked at and are taking a lot of our time to adjust our business to be good enough and appropriate and reduce those emissions. If that level of scrutiny comes down the line around advertised emissions, they're 42 times bigger. So this is a risk we want to have on our map, we want to take seriously, and we want to monitor it and make sure that we are ear to the ground in terms of how to understand to be ahead, really, as this does progress. And there are clearly, as Jonathan shared towards the beginning of the presentation, and Alexis, there is progress from what started out as an idea to an increasingly formalized framework that is being integrated into current reporting disclosures.
Great. I'm sure lots of people have got lots of questions on this, so I'm not gonna hog. But I just there's one thing that I want to ask. It's like from what we hear, like this is like scary, right? There's the operational emissions, and this is like feels quite safe. There's some stretch there, but then to start having a conversation about like clients and 40 times more, and like, can we talk about like a high carbon clients? Because if I talk about it, does that mean I'm saying we shouldn't work with them? It's like somebody said like having this conversation is like a career limiting move, right? So how did you? Can you just talk about how you sort of took that to people that needed to hear it? Because I think that could be really helpful for people who perhaps feel like they're in an environment where talking about this stuff may not be kind of like culturally acceptable. And Pam will ask you the same question as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first up, I didn't just do this out of the blue. I spent a lot of time really understanding who my stakeholders are within Oliver. So, you know, really understanding a sustainable business transformation means understanding the business's overarching goals and priorities, and that means liaising very closely with the C-suite and, you know, the COO and the deputy CEO and so, you know, I'd already had some discussions with our deputy CEO at the time to say, look, there's this thing called advertised emissions. This is what it means. It seems to be gaining traction. It would probably be a good idea for us to get an idea of how we fare when we go through this exercise. And her response was, well, absolutely, you know, being offered additional business information to manage risk. Yes, please. So, you know, off I went and did that exercise with the team. And so then, you know, there was an awful lot of spreadsheets and data and number crunching to work out that very simple insight of 42 times more. But what I shared back with the deputy CEO and with a number of other people at C-suite level was really quite a short deck that just said, look, this is what the kind of landscape looks like at the moment. These are the things that are changing around legislation and regulation, early indicators that certain sectors are going to be changing in a way that will feel fast to a business of our size. Here's the information that we need to understand. impact related to different types of industries and sectors. How are we going to do that? We found a couple of tools. We found Futera's client disclosure report. We found advertised emissions, and we're part of a working group because this is an evolving area. It's developing. It's not finalized. Nobody's got the one simple template, unfortunately, that we can all use, the same methodology. And here's what we found out so far. This is what it means. This should go on the risk register. It's something we should keep an eye on, and it is a part of our risk register for the business as well. So it was really couched as quite a practical, pragmatic business risk conversation. As I say, there is a flip side. There is an opportunity side to that as well. There's, making sure, to Pam's point, you don't suddenly have a hole in your revenue line because a certain sector has been regulated away out of advertising. But it's also anticipating those sectors that are going to arise or grow rapidly and benefit from a net zero transition, and making sure we're their closest partners too.
Thank you. Folks, we're going to do, when we do the Q&A, after the Q&A, we're going to ask you to think about the actions that you need to take in order to advance this work. It might be one of the actions is to hear more from Pam and Lucy about this stuff, or whatever. So just feel like if this is really rich and this kind of data, this kind of insight would give you some feed your ability to change things, then please kind of include that within the final question I'm going to ask you. Pam, how do you navigate this kind of conversation? The challenges of, what are the challenges of this conversation, and how are you successfully navigating them?
So I think just back to Lucy's point, you really need to think about why you're having the conversation. If you're just going to the board and saying, oh no, we've got all these emissions, you're not, that's not really going to get you anywhere. You need to think about what service that has to the business. Is it about being able to identify new risks? Is it about identifying new opportunities? Is it one of the key ones for me is identifying which clients you might have that you can have different conversations with, and then potentially gain organic growth for your business through those conversations by helping to, looking at clients that have high impacts, but then also have new products and services that they might, somewhere in their sustainability team, they might want to be promoting, but haven't yet got the traction internally. Can we have different conversations with those clients and get some of that work and help them drive their own sustainability goals? So the key, and it will probably vary business by business, but the key is to understand why, or to think about what your story is, what your message is, and how that links to your commercial goals.
Fantastic, how that links to your commercial goals, exactly. So just before we just move to Q&A, is there anything else you want to share that you feel like this conversation has led you kind of to think, here's the one thing I think I still need to say into the room? Maybe it's something, positive outcomes, or any change that's happened in your organization, or anything else. Is there anything else that is coming up for you that you feel that you want to say?
I think one of the things I want to say is that and I said this in the previous sessions that we've had, but get started early, even if it is just mapping your top 10 clients, or setting a threshold on your finance system of which clients you're going to look at. Even small steps will just help start the conversation and help you think about things differently. And then the second thing is make sure that you're linking to the commercial impacts on your business. This isn't a sustainability conversation, it's a commercial conversation.
Right.
And that you'll have to have the conversation lots and lots of times. Don't think you can have it once and it's done.
Agree with all of those. And I would add, trust that this is the long game. So as I said, you won't necessarily get the satisfaction of seeing all the benefits that will play out of you doing this work in the time that you're in the role that you're in now. Most people stay in their roles 2-3 years in this industry, if you're lucky. But trust that it's going to have, you're building on a longer term positive impact by doing this. So I would say that. I would also say I'm really fortunate actually in Oliver that I've already been able to see some quite significant benefits, and by having conversations like this and making it business related, to Pam's point, and linking it to the commercial and understanding risks and opportunities. In the UK, the CEO agreed this time last year that we wouldn't have any fossil fuel clients on our prospects or pitching lists anymore. We actually don't have any clients in that sector, which puts us in a fortunate position. And now it's, you know, part of policy that we'll keep it that way. But that's been a conversation that's been rumbling on for kind of 18 months. And, you know, leadership quite rightly challenged me at the start and said, we hear your passion, Lucy, but where do we draw the line? And so that then, you know, I began the journey of really getting into objective ways of putting this across to the business and researching it really thoroughly and making sure I knew my argument inside out. And, you know, I'm fortunate that I've seen some of the positive changes of that come through in the business whilst I'm still in this role. But yeah, not everyone will be so lucky, but trust that you are building on a more positive future by getting going on this. And I will also say, just rip the Band-Aid off. It was nowhere near as bad to go through the methodology as I thought it was going to be. I kept putting it off, and then we did it, and we were like, oh, was that it? It turns out the stakeholder conversations are actually the meatier part of the challenge. And if anyone has any concerns or challenges around that, I mean, I don't want to speak to Pam, but I'm sure you would be as well. We'd be so happy to run another session or a bit of a working discussion group. Whatever the barriers are, it's likely Pam and I have jumped them, fallen over them, come into contact with them in some way, and really want these learnings to be shared. So don't be shy and do get in touch.
Great, that's really kind. Okay, so we're just about to move to Q&A. So if you've got any, can someone just drop the link into the document, just to give you a couple of minutes to put in any questions that you may not have already thought, as just a little moment to kind of reflect and formulate any questions that you have, and then the Dean can start asking the questions. Just before we've spoken a couple of times, but I'm just always the thing that kind of strikes me is just how willing you are to share your learning. It's just really, working in advertising, it's like really competitive, right? And so like you're conditioned to be protective of your IP, protective of your ideas, protective of your learning, because that apparently is going to give you competitive advantage. But what I see from you two and what we're trying to do with the Advertised Emissions Working Group is trying to even model a different way of being, of where we're happy to share best practice, we're happy to share the learning, we're happy to kind of share both the highs and the lows, etc. So I'm just really grateful that you're modeling what perhaps we can all be doing more of, which is wonderful. And also, I just think, this feels like, I'll just come up with a term, it's like threshold work, isn't it? Like you're crossing a threshold from one way of being and one way of thinking about things. Let's just focus on the things we have to focus on, the operational emissions, and the threshold into what will become, what needs to be done. And like that kind of is really juicy, challenging work. Yeah, what does the threshold look like? Where are the thresholds in the conversations? How do I approach this work? How do I head towards the horizon that I see that maybe the business doesn't see? How do I see that the Spitfire needs to get built rather than believing that it doesn't? And what's the tinkering and the experimentation, the rights and wrongs in terms of helping me get there? So I'm just really grateful to have met you and be working with you. And yeah, thank you so much. Nadine, any questions?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of questions. Thank you everyone for adding your questions to the doc. I've been trying to sort of cluster them into themes, but I guess we'll get started with a couple of practical questions for Lucy and Pam. Jonathan and Alexis, please don't go anywhere. There are some for you as well, but hold on. So first question, are any clients surprised when you ask them about service emissions? Have there been any hostile clients or responses to this discussion? Questions?
I can have a go at this, but Pam, jump in if you've got more. Where I'm up to at the moment, I'm mainly having discussions internally still at the highest level, but I haven't actually had any direct conversation with a client around service emissions yet, and that's okay. That's on the journey. Having said that, we ran a sustainability kind of roundtable breakfast last year, and naturally it attracted clients of our own who are more ambitious in this space, and ended up sitting next to someone in one of our clients in a law firm. He was way ahead on this stuff. He knew all about it. He was like, oh, it's great that you're involved in that. So there are definitely pockets of people who are already kind of on the train of this, and it might in their industry look a little bit different or be called something else. But I don't think it's perhaps as radical as some people think. I think actually there's pockets of this happening all over the place. And the more you hang out in spaces that say sustainable business across the door or something similar, the more likely you are to find people already well on board with this. I don't know if you've got any advice.
Yeah, perhaps a slightly different view. I think if you're talking to sustainability teams, that's almost certainly the case. I don't know whether I would sit in a client meeting with a client's marketing team and start talking about serviced emissions. Instead, I would be talking about, what's the outcome? Serviced emissions isn't the outcome, serviced emissions is the tool. So if the outcome is we know internally that we have this really high carbon client and we believe that we could be doing something else with them that helps them become slightly less high carbon without greenwashing, then that's the conversation that you should be having with them. How can we help you fulfill your sustainability goals? Not we're wagging a finger at you and telling you you're super high carbon because we've done some serviced emissions exercise.
Thank you both. Another kind of similar question is, we see companies and brands sometimes avoid communicating genuine sustainability actions due to fear of being perceived as greenwashing. This trend may result in less communication about sustainability, lower awareness, etc. What are your views on this, and how can we avoid the pervasive effects of greenwashing?
I take that one first and you jump in, Lucy. Okay. So when I talk to teams internally about greenwashing, my biggest piece of advice is that if you talk about the green credentials of a business, you might convert, I don't know what the figure is, 13 to 16% of the population that are super greens, but you're probably not going to convert anyone else. And so actually it's not about the front piece of the green credentials. Is more about making a product desirable, not about talking about how green it is. So and actually serviced emissions is really helpful for that, because the serviced emissions piece underneath helps you identify whether something is contributing to the sustainability transition, but what you do from a marketing point of view doesn't necessarily have to include that content. It's more a way for you in the back end to understand your clients.
Great response. That's hard to add to. I would just say, yeah, I hear about green hushing a lot, as it's termed. And when I get folks come up to me within the business asking for a bit of advice, they're a bit concerned perhaps usually about something they're doing for their client as opposed to what we're doing for our own business. What I usually say to them is, I'm like, well, if you or the client are struggling with how to say this in the right way, it's probably because it hasn't been done. So if an action has been taken, or a product has been changed, or there is an evidence-based improvement, then that should be very easy to talk about. That shouldn't require additional skills. So if there is a struggle around that, I would question, has the action actually been done that we're trying to communicate? Because if it's hard to talk about, it probably hasn't been, or not thoroughly enough.
Alexis?
Yeah, if I could also just say, similar to what Lucy just said, we also hear a lot about this, and I think the best principle as in life is like, honesty is the best policy. If you have done something, then you're very welcome to say it. And the EU Green Claims Directive is really about cracking down on unsubstantiated claims. And I think what I would love to see businesses do more is just be a bit more upfront with the path that they're taking, and saying, this is our goal and this is what we're trying to get to. These are the things that we might be finding difficult, rather than trying to kind of hide behind their progress in a sustainability report, which is where they get caught out by civil society and others, and then maybe get clamped down, and then they don't want to share. But if they say, our goal is to comply with these standards or to do this, you're still kind of in the clear at that point. And I do think that creates a bit more of an environment where you could share, rather than fearing the backlash.
Great, thank you so much. And a segue into serviced emissions, one question is around to Alexis and Jonathan, perhaps. How do you engage like-minded movements such as B Corp or Citizen Collective that already have a momentum to drive adoption of serviced emissions across the industry?
That's a great question. I think, I guess, so we have obviously strategized to try to include in standards, but we haven't yet actually tried to see about other movement oriented, like B Corp would be a great one to target. I think yeah, I'll take that on board to try to see how other ways we could collaborate with them. I guess the main thing is just making sure that there's some consistency across the landscape, so there's not a wide divergence between what B Corp is doing and what SBTI is doing, for example. So trying to make sure that there's sort of a minimum good level of criteria between all of them, and then targeting the ones that are most used. But I agree with trying to target the ones that have precedent for good, high integrity behavior.
Yeah, great. It's interesting. Sam Baker is on the call from Business Declares. So I think that, so there's a sort of segue then into kind of like more of the business community. Creatives for Climate are on the call. So again, that's kind of speaking to the kind of a broader long tail from the advertising and marketing communications industry. Yeah, I think we've got somebody asking us, can we launch this at Sydney Climate Week in Australia? So I think people are coming forward that it seems to appeal to, but kind of like those strategic alliances. I think that's also one of so we're open. Anybody wants to talk to us, we'll talk. We'll talk. I think actually with the funding that Oxford Net Zero, I think that could be quite a critical role that you can play. It's like, how does it fit within the landscape of people that want to change, whether it's other organizations, other verticals within professional service providers, other sort of civil society or other groups in other jurisdictions. I think that's a really good question of like, what's our strategy to help disseminate this the most efficiently and most powerfully? I think is a great question for us to think about. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks. And another question around service emissions, it is what uptake in other industries have you seen with the idea of service emissions, and how does this compare to advertising?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that one. I'd say the most sort of the next most kind of uptake has been on advised emissions, so in the legal sector. So the Law Society has given quite a bit of guidance on where lawyers sit, because they obviously have it's kind of interesting in regulated versus regulated industries that have professional certifications attached, etc. Are slightly more beholden, especially in the legal sector, where there is this right to representation that kind of underpins many legal systems, especially in the UK and in Canada and the United States, things like that. So I do think lawyers sit in an interesting space. But what the legal charter, Legal Law Society has done has provided some existing guidance, and then the Legal Charter 1.5 is trying to bring firms together around not only advised emissions, but also other ways in which the law impacts climate change. And so they've given some guidance generally on how to, like a little bit of methodological guidance on how to generally bucket your clients and types of projects, and they may be starting to do a little bit more work on trying to identify a methodology for measuring advised emissions. So say the legal sector has been keen, and then what we're trying to do is close the gap on the management consultancy sector, because they, I would say, are probably the most laggard at the moment in terms of there's really not a body that gathers them all together and tries to get them to grapple with this idea of service emissions.
I'd love to add a practical example, if I may, Alexis. That was beautifully put about the action around law sector. So we work with a global law client, and recently we were asked by their procurement team to update our contract with an appendix which stipulated very clearly the requirement from them for us to have and demonstrate a climate transition plan, to have science-based targets submitted to the SBTI within 6 months of signing this appendix, which is quite challenging, by the way, for anyone who's not gone through that juicy process yet. Very worthwhile, though. These grey hairs are from then. And there is a clause in there now that says, if we feel that you as a supplier are putting our own net zero targets at risk, because you are a key supplier of ours, then we have the right to terminate this contract and enter into discussions around that. So you know, I noticed a little bit, some of us were talking about, you know, the transition will come. So far as I'm concerned, we're very much in it. And that's not the only client contract where it's very much in black and white, where if we're not demonstrating very real detailed emissions reductions annually, we will be pulled in front of procurement and asked why, and given corrective actions, and need to demonstrate that we're taking that very seriously. So there is a ramping up, and I'm impressed at the rigor, but not surprised, because they're lawyers, of the law industry in that area. And there is a project called the Chancery Lane Project, which is freely available for anyone to go and look up online, with pre-written clauses written by lawyers. If you are looking to update your own supplier contracts or any legal documents, really handy. Looking at the wording, it can save you quite a bit of time. And I imagine that's what all the law firms are using as they cascade this through their supply chains.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and this wouldn't be part of advertised emissions if there's no question about the methodology. So, Jonathan, this one's for you. So how exactly are advertised or serviced emissions calculated? And there's a follow-on question from Sam as well, but I'll let you answer this one first.
So in the initial couple of reports, the calculation, we work with magic numbers, the econometrics agency, and kind of taking a leaf out of the finance emissions book. The way that we did the calculation was advertising spend times by the return on investment of that spend times by the carbon footprint of the thing that you were selling. So if you were spending a lot of money on something high carbon like SUVs, and that had an ROI which was high because the advertising was really effective, and SUVs obviously being a very high carbon product, then your advertised emissions would be really high. So yeah, it's that basic thing. So advertising spend is a known quantity because that's reported by Nielsen. In terms of ROI, that was coming from the ARC database, which is owned by the IPA and Magic Numbers. So this is the best in class numbers, case studies that demonstrate the return on investment of advertising across 19 different categories, like £4 billion worth of spend over a few years. And then the carbon footprint of the thing you're selling is available from the ONS and XGO database. So all publicly available data sources.
Thanks,
And
Jonathan.
if I could quickly jump in on that one, there's kind of an obsession over methodologies in the academic sector, and we have some colleagues of mine actually down the road from us at the business school in Oxford who have done some work on advertised emissions, or the advertising sector and net zero. And it's quite interesting, the relationship between academia and funders, and what kind of research you produce based on who funds you. But the conclusion that these business scholars came to was really that operational emissions should be the utmost focus, that we shouldn't look any further beyond operational emissions. And I think that I just think it's a bit of a flawed and a bit of a defeatist attitude towards, you don't need to have pure methodological accuracy. I think in order to understand, Lucy and Pam spoke to this earlier, getting the contours of who you're working with and understanding that and doing the due diligence is the process. You don't need 99.9% accuracy. Choosing your biggest clients and going from there, I think, is the best way to start, rather than trying to get a perfect image. Even in the corporate accounting, the climate corporate accounting space, which has been around for multiple decades, we still haven't found a good way to fully measure all of our emissions. So I think having a sort of common sense approach, using the advertised emissions methodology and getting a sense of where you're at, rather than trying to get 100% clarity, is the way to get started on action, because that's the ultimate goal.
Thanks, Alexis. Yeah, that was the work that was commissioned by the Advertising Association from Side Business School, right? Yeah, I thought that was an interesting intervention, and I'm really pleased that you're in agreement that from an Oxford net zero point of view, it's don't let perfection be the enemy of the good, and start from where you can, which is exactly what Lucy and Pam, rather than perhaps the suggestion that you should wait for perfection. So thank you for saying that, and I know there's some net zero people on the call, so maybe that's something that they would also be appreciative of listening to. Anything? So one of the things that we wanted, Nadine, anything, there was a part 2 to the question, wasn't there?
There was. It's related to a sort of the technicalities of the methodology, but just I'll answer that really quickly. So we are collaborating with the University of Portsmouth and working with members of the advertising industry across multiple organizations to try to find a solution that's practical, that works for the industry, co-created with the industry. So if you have any questions or any input or feedback that you'd like to give us, please do reach out, and we'll keep everyone posted around where we get to in our research.
Thank you. Thank you. And just to say, what's really wonderful is AdNet Zero starting to talk about service emissions and have set up a working group, and it's our intention that there should be a coming together, because I think it's really important that this work gets the highest visibility and the highest kind of rollout that it can. So for it to be part of AdNet Zero, and for them to accept that, you know, the move from operational emissions to service emissions is necessary as part of the transition is a really fantastic kind of move, and we're really grateful that they're doing that. So yeah, we're excited about the possibility of working together with them.